Hi everyone, I'm Adam and this is Modern Windows Fan Video. This is episode 2 of our Project Sienna tutorial. In this video we're going to be covering rules, contexts, and interaction. So this video is going to be a little bit more conceptual. These next two videos are going to be kind of conceptual. In our first video we covered the basics of the user interface. We pretty much just covered what the names of all the different parts of Project Sienna are, but we didn't get too much into what they do. That video was important because for the rest of the series I'm going to be using all this Project Sienna jargon, and you'll probably need to know what it all means to follow along. So if you haven't checked out the first video, you probably should. And then now we're going to start really getting into the nuts and bolts of how Project Sienna works and how to build apps with it. We're going to go over some of the concepts that you're going to need to build apps. Some of this is going to be a bit conceptual, like I said, but if you follow along and if you try the examples, you should be okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is something we talked about a little in the previous video, which is properties. So if I add a visual, like a button, we know that down here in the edit bar through these windows or in the express view, we can see all these properties. So just like a physical object in everyday life has properties, like its weight, or its height, or its color, our visuals have properties like alignment, border style, fill, font, etc. So if you really think about applications, think about apps in terms of its visuals, you know, its buttons and its labels and its images. What an app really is a series of changes to the properties of visuals based on user input. So a lot of what we'll be doing in Project Sienna is changing the values of these properties based on what the user does. So that brings us right into behaviors. Behaviors are like a special kind of property. A behavior is sort of like an event or a signal that a visual kind of gives off or emits under some certain condition. So we've got our button here, you can see it right here, and we've got it selected, and so we're in the express view, so we're looking at all the properties of that button, and under here, under behavior, it says on select. On select is the behavior that the button does. I can't think of a better word, that the button does when the user taps on it. Different visuals have different behaviors. So if I hide Express View and bring out the visuals palette, and I go to a drop-down menu and add a drop-down menu to our screen, and go to Express View, you'll see it has an on-change behavior and an on-select behavior. On-change is when the user actually changes the value in the drop-down, and on-select is when the user taps on it. So we're going to go ahead and delete that because we're never going to use it. And so we've got our button and we've got our on-select behavior. So you can see where we're going with this. We're probably going to use behaviors to change properties, right? So if a user taps on a button, we might want that to update a text label. That would be using a behavior to change a property. And how would we do that? Well, we do that through something called rules. A rule is just a little bit of code, really, really simple code that will do some bit of logic for you. So you could write a rule for a behavior. So you could say the behavior triggers the rule. And that rule could modify a property of a visual. Okay, see how this is all tying together? So visuals have properties and behaviors. When you interact with a visual, that causes a behavior to trigger any rule that is associated with it, and that rule can do any sort of logic, like modifying a property. So here, the default, you can see right here, the default behavior for on select for this button is false. So all that means is don't do anything. So on select by default is false, it's not doing anything. So we could, for example, use that on select. We could write a rule for that on select behavior to change the property of some other visual. But there's kind of a catch. This is going to be the most conceptual part of this. If you can get this down, you'll be okay. You can't directly change a property of a visual. You have to change what's called a context. You associate, okay, you set the value of a property for a visual to a context, and then you can update that context from a behavior. So what's a context? If you're a programmer, a context is a variable. And if you're a programmer, you already understand what I'm talking about. If you're not a programmer, if you think back to your algebra, if you remember what a mathematical variable is, so it's just a little placeholder, it's just a little bucket where you can store a value. A context is a variable just like that. And if you've never taken algebra, or if it's been a really long time, a context is a variable. It's just a place where you can store a value. So for example, we could create a context called my color and set it to a value of red. And then anytime we told a property to be filled with my color, it would be filled with red, okay? So the way we would, let's say, for example, change the text in a label based on a user pressing a button, we would have a rule in the onSelect behavior of that button, modify a context, and we would have that text value set to that context. And so that was kind of conceptual, so why don't we go ahead and actually do that and see what it looks like. So we're going to add a text label here, and we're going to set its size kind of high so we can see it. And let's do the same thing with our button. Sorry, because it's a little small size here. Okay. And remember, these edit menus down here in the edit bar, these are simply changing values in the Express view. They're the same properties. These edit functions down here are just modifying properties. An Express view just shows you all of the properties kind of laid out. So we want, when we press this button, we want to change the value of label. Well, we said we can't change a property just directly. We need to use a context as a pass-through. So we're going to do Express view. We've got our label selected. We're going to set the text value to my text. So now we've told Sienna, hey, the text property of label 1 is the context my text. You can see there's little squigglies under my text and it says invalid name if I hover over it. That's because we haven't actually defined a value for my text yet. It's not set to anything. We're going to use our button for that. So let's select our button. And now let's write our first bit of really simple code, our first rule. So we're going to go to the onSelect behavior of our button, and we're going to say update context, okay? And we're going to do an open squiggly bracket here, and we're going to say my text colon hello world. And we're going to close out all of our brackets and stuff. Okay, so what does that say again? It says update context, and then open parentheses, open squiggly bracket, my text, colon, hello world. We're saying update the value of the context, my text, to hello world, okay? And if you remember, our text property for our label is set to my text. So if we go ahead and preview this, hello world, okay? So we use the button, we press the button updates the context, my text, to a value of hello world, and our label is set to display my text. But why don't we make it a little more interesting? Let's add some user input, okay? So let's add a text input. I mean an input text, sorry. An input text is exactly what it sounds like. It's a place for a user to input some text. So let's, again, let's make it a little bigger so you can see it better. Now we're going to select our input text. We're going to do express view here. We're going to set its default value to 2 quotes because we don't want it to have any default value when it starts up. Now we're going to modify our rule a little. Okay, we're going to say update context my text, but instead of hello world, we're going to do input text 1, which is the name of our input text that we just created. Then we're going to say exclamation point text. Okay, that exclamation point, programmers call an exclamation point a bang because exclamation point is a mouthful of a word. So we're going to say bang for the rest of this series. So what did we write there? Input text 1 bang text. What that's telling us is the text property of input text 1. Whenever you add a visual to Project Sienna, it gives it a name. That name is going to be like the visual type and then a number. So like input text 1 would be your first input text 2 would be your second. You can actually set these to any name you want. You don't have to use these horrible default names. The way you do that is with a menu up here that we can't see because I've got snap on. So I'm gonna take myself out of the equation for a second here. Now when I tap on this button, we can see up here it says input text 1. I could call that my input text or whatever I want, but that's the name of this button, of this input text. Just like this button is button 1. This label is label 1, okay? I'm gonna bring myself back into the equation here. And so let's go back to our rule and read that again in light of what we've just seen. Update context my text. So we're saying set the value of my text, the my text context, to input text 1 bang text. So the text value of input text 1. Whenever you see that bang, it means we're talking about a property of a visual. So input text 1 bang text is the text value of the text property of input text 1. Okay, so let's look at our whole app again here. We have label 1, which is set, its text property is set to my text. We have button 1, which is set to have an on select of updating the context of the my text context to input text 1's text value. And input text 1 doesn't have any text value. So we're going to play hello world. Ta-da! Modern Windows. No, it wrapped. Alright, so do you understand what's going on there? When we press the button, we're setting the my text context to the value of whatever is in here. So the user types in here, and then because this label is bound to whatever value is in my text, we update the label. So that is when you really, I want you to sit back and really, if you haven't thought about how software works before, that's really all software does. No matter how big and fancy the app is, the software is kind of sitting there with what's called a data model. So that's the data it works on. In our case, our context is our data model. It's just a little variable. And it uses the user interface to display that data model, so to visualize it. So we've got our label, we've got our input text, and then we have our button. And our button is waiting for user input, and when the user hits it, it runs our logic and does what we want. It modifies our properties. So at its most basic level, that's what you will be doing with Sienna, and really that's what you'd be doing in software development with any tool. All right, so what I'd like you to do is to play around with Project Sienna a little bit and see what you can do with it, whether or not you can kind of reproduce what we did here, and maybe take it a little further. And for some inspiration, I'm going to really quickly make a little bit different of a user interface here, and I'm not going to go as deep explaining it, and see if you can reproduce the results. So we're going to add a circle. we're going to set that circle's fill. So fill is the color that we fill a visual with. Like if I set it to yellow or orange, we're going to set its fill property to my color. Okay, and we haven't defined my color. Then we're going to create 2 more buttons. We're going to fill this button with red. I'm going to fill this button with green. And then we're going to say, let's look at our circle again and say, okay, that fill is called my color. So my color is our context. For the red button, we're going to do on select, update context, my color, colon, button 2, bang, fill. And we're actually going to copy that. And so I just copied that rule, and I'm going to select our other button here. So that was the red button. I'm going to select the green button. And I'm going to paste it, but I'm going to change it from button 2 fill to button 3 fill. So update context, my color, button 3 fill. Okay. And let's press play. Look at that. When I press the button, it sets the color of the circle to the button. So that's episode 2. We covered rules, contexts, behaviors, and properties, kind of more in depth. So go out and fire up Project Sienna and get to using behaviors to modify the properties of visuals. Thanks.